Alright, as the title says, here is a look back at the most common matchups from patch 12.10. If you are an LEC or an LCS fan, you'll be like, why are we going over 12.10? We're on 12.11. Well, the LCK and LPL both were playing on 12.10 until today. And throughout all of spring and even MSI, you'll see I made a video after MSI called Most Common Champion Matchups or Most Common Matchups. And we looked back and we just, reminisced about what the most common matchups were just to kind of get an idea of what the meta was across all the regions combined, because a lot of us are in our own echo chamber of a specific region or one or two regions. Minor region teams might not even be really fully aware of how different their minor region meta is versus what the major regions are. And it gives you some insight on what an international event may hold when we get later into the split. Obviously, right now, 12.10 holds like no value when it comes to worlds, but still, it's nice to look at. In top lane between the LPL and LCK, we had 26 different champions picked. Kale versus Gwen was the most common matchup, occurring 6 times. And then Sejuani happens to be like the most picked champion in top lane, pretty much, being countered by Gnar and Gangplank 5 times each. You'll see that I don't have more information on there. I don't have like who had the stronger win rate in the matchup because it only happened a handful of times. It has to happen at least 10 times for me to go to that length to see how it looks versus how the win rate looks, because really in 6 matchups we don't really know how does that matchup go. And even then, you have to keep in mind this is all within a vacuum. This does not mean that this matchup always will go in this way. It's just that within a vacuum, when you take out all the variables and it's simply this champion was picked, this champion was picked, regardless of everything else, this is how it has went over this amount of matchups in pro play. So Sejuani was a big pick top though. The top meta was, you saw some Fiora, we saw some Jace, but Kale versus Gwen was the skill matchup, and then if those were banned, people defaulted to Sejuani, and whatever you want to play into it. If GP was up, people picked GP. If Gnar was up, people picked Gnar. We saw some Aatrox, Ornn, Sion, all sorts of different things. Okay, now when we get to the jungle, you'll see Viego. 20 different champions picked, but still, it's all about Viego and what you picked into it. Most matchups had a Wukong or a Viego in it. Wukong Viego happening 22 times, Wukong coming out ahead 59% of the time. And then when you look at Lee Sin versus Viego, 16 matchups and it was a draw, 50-50. Both champions won 8 times. It's all about Viego and what you want to pick into it. Nobody really wanted to ban anything else. When people started picking Wukong, we saw some AP champions getting involved into the meta. We saw some Diana, some Lilia. It's just it's interesting. It really is, because you see some trends. You see some trends of what the meta was. And obviously, if we watched it, we knew that. But nevertheless, it's nice to look back at. And Trundle started out like 4 for 4 against Viego, and then Viego won I think the last 3 matchups. But Trundle looked like a good pick against Viego at first, and then teams got used to it. In mid lane, we saw 23 different champions picked, a lot of it revolving around Ahri, Swain, and Azir. Ahri versus Lissandra, Lissandra being the counter to Ahri, the one that RNG and, RNG developed at MSI and Jiahu developed, coming, to fruition here. If Lissandra was banned, we knew Ahri was being picked. If Ahri was up, we knew the other team was willing to play Lissandra. That's kind of how it was. And then if Lissandra was banned and people still picked the Ahri, we saw Swain into it. And sometimes if we saw Swain, we saw Azir. And if we saw Azir, we saw Corki. Just like, you see how the meta just seems to, almost like a staircase, you just go to the next step of what the counters are to each other. Obviously, none of these matchups happening a ton of times because we only had a week and a half of action or so between the two. Well, LPL had 2 weeks, but 2 weeks and 2 days. But the LCK had 1 week of action on this patch, so, limited amount of games. In bot lane, it's common that we see jungle and bot have multiple matchups occurring a lot. Kesa versus Ezreal being the most common, happening 15 times. Kesa coming out ahead 73% of the time. We knew this. At MSI, we realized it. People were picking Ezreal, but then Kesa came back in the meta as a dive comp option at the AD carry spot to beat the Ezreal, and it happened often. 3 out of every 4 times, pretty much, Kesa came out ahead of Ezreal. And people are still picking Ezreal first pick, and the Kesa sitting there. You know, it's almost like, why are you doing that? Don't do that. Like, that's a waste of time. But picking Ezreal into Kalista made sense. A lot of people like the Kalista. Well, Ezreal in 11 matchups, 73% win rate. So 3 out of 4 games, Ezreal was winning over Kalista. Now, obviously, this is in a vacuum. Not all AD carries are created equally. Obviously, the Kalista support is a massive factor, given the you know, um, ultimate and things like that. But Ezreal, 73% win rate over Kalista. We saw Senna versus Ezreal 7 times, and we saw Aphelios versus Kalista 6 times. We're seeing more Aphelios in 12.11, and we'll see how that goes going forward. But it was pretty much the Ezreal patch, and what did you want to pick into it? Ezreal being first picked, Kalista being banned often, even though Ezreal was strong against Kalista. Kesa was a good pick into it. Support, we don't see a ton of Braum in the Western regions, but Braum versus Nautilus was the most common matchup. Leona falling off to the side, Braum taking her place. We saw that matchup 12 times in the LPL and LCK combined, and it going 6-6. Obviously, Braum blocks the Nautilus hook, but nevertheless, we saw it often. Karma versus Renata was our top enchanter matchup, happening 5 times, and then if the Braum was banned, or people want to pick a Zaya or whatever, Rakan was picked into Nautilus as well 5 times. We saw 23 different supports picked during patch 12.10, but that's it for the look back at 12.10. Comment down below, what do you think of this meta? What are you going to take from it as we go to 12.11? What do you think might be here for 12.11? What do you think might go away? Like the video if you like it, subscribe to the channel for daily League of Legends content. If you missed my roundup this morning, I did go over the matchups that occurred. We did have Gen G versus Damwon Kia this morning, so if you didn't know that, I recapped the series in that video. But nevertheless, thank you for watching, and I hope you come back for more content.